Hello everyone, and welcome to TBR's webinar, The Impact of Cloud and SDN on Enterprise Network Vendor Business Models, Insight from TBR's Enterprise Network Vendor Benchmark, with TBR Analyst Scott Dennehy. I'm Justin Surgeon, and I'm hosting today's webinar. With hardware commoditization driven by cloud and software-defined networking, or SDN, threatening to upend the networking industry, enterprise network vendors are transforming their business models to maintain relevancy and drive long-term growth. This includes aligning their resources and leveraging key partnerships to capture growth opportunities in emerging segments such as cloud, mobility, and security. Today's webinar will touch on findings from our Enterprise Network Vendor Benchmark. Senior Analyst Scott Dennehy will share his perspectives on the changes in the enterprise network market due to implementation of cloud and SDN technologies. Before I pass this over to Scott, there are a few housekeeping items I'd like to cover. First, we will be recording today's session and posting it on our YouTube site, TBRI channel. We encourage you to watch this presentation or any of the others we've posted. Second, we'd like to hear your opinions and thoughts on the material we're presenting. Please send any questions or comments to the Q&A or chat function. We'll address them at the end of the webinar. Third, we'll send out the slides to everyone registered for today's webcast within 24 hours of the conclusion of the webinar. You can also find the slides, as well as our thought leadership pieces, other webinars, and commentaries on SlideShare at slideshare.net/TBR_market_insight. Now let me introduce the analyst presenting today. Scott Dennehy is a senior analyst here in TBR's networking and mobility practice. Scott is responsible for directing TBR's enterprise networking research, which includes SDN and network infrastructure services. And with that, let me hand this over to Scott.
Thanks, Justin, and thank you, everybody, for joining today. As Justin said, today we're going to discuss major shifts happening in the enterprise network market, specifically related to trends like cloud and SDN and how they're impacting vendor business models and how those vendor business models are changing to adapt to those changes and how these companies are striving to remain relevant in the market over the long term. So there's really three areas that we're going to cover today. The first is essentially what's driving this transformation. Why are our vendors trying to evolve their business models? And a lot of it comes down to, as Justin noted, cloud and SDN are big drivers of this. And specifically, if we look at the market and forecast it over the next several years, and I'll share some data points around this, it's becoming clear that really the growth in the network market is coming from areas like software and services and not hardware. So vendors that have existed and survived on hardware for a long time have to make changes in their business model if they want to survive over the long term. The other piece of it is the impact on customer buying trends. What we're seeing more and more in the marketplace is customers placing value on solutions, particularly those solutions that deliver a business outcome versus a particular point product that might support a particular technological need or otherwise, or have certain features and functionality that a customer might value. Then we'll get into the how. So what are the strategies that these vendors are using to make this transformation? And while there are certainly many of them, the ones that we'll focus on are a headcount restructuring or realignment. So in essence, vendors making sure that they have their resources allocated appropriately to capture the revenue opportunities in some of these emerging segments. And then and second one is around that business outcome, those business outcome solutions. So in other words, we know that the influence of line of business buyers and business buyers is increasing in the IT market. In other words, these business buyers are having a growing influence on IT purchase decisions. So vendors that can effectively develop their solutions and their messaging to appeal to those buyers are the ones that have the best chances of success. And then lastly, we'll talk about some of the strategic alliances that are developing around some of these emerging segments like cloud and mobility and SDN. And then lastly, we'll talk about what's at stake here. And really, I think it comes down to survival. So companies that aren't able to make this evolution and aren't able to adapt to the impact of these trends on their business essentially won't survive, and I think you'll see some consolidation in the market over the next several years as a lot of these companies are essentially gobbled up because they really don't have any other option. So first, let's get into some of the high-level trends that we're seeing in the market, and what you see here on the slide is a comparison of how customers are viewing network solutions in the market today. If you go back a number of years in the networking space, and this is certainly still prevalent today, a lot of the strategy, the sales strategy for vendors is really around leading with a particular product, say it's a hardware with an embedded operating system, or could be some on-premise software, and then attaching some services to those products, whether they're maintenance services or maybe some deployment and installation. So essentially a product-led model. That is quickly becoming a commodity, particularly when you look at things like SDN and the potential there around more commodity-type hardware and not needing the big proprietary expensive pieces of hardware anymore. And what customers are now starting to increasingly value are solutions, so particularly solutions that are tied to business outcomes. And when I say solution, it's a solution that really ties together all of the three components, hardware, software, and services. Now, you could certainly make an argument that the old way did essentially the same thing if you've got a piece of hardware that's got software, whether it's OS or management, and then some services. But nowadays, it's really about how those solutions are packaged, sold, and delivered. So in essence, packaged in more of a business outcome type of orientation, sold in more of a services-led type of model, so beginning with consulting and talking about what the needs are of a particular customer from a business point of view, and then bringing the solutions of the products through that way, and then how they're delivered. We're seeing that customers are showing an increased appetite for more of an OpEx-based consumption and purchasing model for networking communications products. And that leads to things like everything as a service and managed services. So really it's about how things are packaged and sold and delivered, which is really driving a lot of transformation for vendors. So to get into some hard data points that kind of back up some of these concepts, showing some data from research that was recently published in our enterprise networking market forecast. So this is a 5-year forecast that looks at market opportunity for both the entire market and the segments that you see there at the bottom of the chart. So that's network infrastructure, which are things like routers and switches and WAN optimization, application delivery controllers, those kinds of things. Wireless LAN, so that's your wireless access points and controllers. Unified communications and collaboration, so that includes things like voice over IP, IP telephony, collaboration and unified communication software, those kinds of products. And then lastly, the services around all of those products, so your maintenance, deployment, professional services, even things that are being delivered through the cloud, such as unified communications as a service. And as you can see, the segments that have a larger percentage of hardware in them or depend more on hardware, so that's things like network infrastructure and unified communications. The growth rate or the compound annual growth rate over the next 5 years for those types of solutions is much lower than what we see from something like services. So you can understand why vendors need to make the shift and evolve that business model away from those kind of hardware-driven product segments more towards things like services, because that's really where the revenue opportunities are and are going to be. So now we can talk a little bit about the impact of some of these trends on specific vendors. And what I show here is a chart that's from our enterprise network vendor benchmark. We track 16 vendors right now across the segments that I mentioned earlier. And so what this chart shows is essentially their total enterprise network revenue across all the segments that they participate in and the year-to-year revenue growth for the third quarter of 2014. And what I've highlighted here are some vendors that are predominantly in the unified communication space. And the reason I've done that is because I think unified communications is an area where we're seeing the biggest impact in an area like cloud as customers look to things like collaboration as a service, unified communications as a service. That is really the first segment that we've seen a lot of movement around as far as that shift away from the traditional hardware or on-premise software model towards a cloud delivery model. As you can see, these vendors are really struggling to grow their revenue because they've relied historically so much on hardware. And as that continues, these vendors are really going to have to quickly make that transformation, be able to capitalize on some of these trends and make sure that their core business doesn't decline so rapidly that they're really left with no other option. Now, contrast that with vendors that are in the networking space but are more software-oriented. And staying on the cloud topic, what you find is that cloud really provides opportunities for those vendors and has really been a big driver of their success in terms of revenue growth, whether you're a company like Microsoft that has the pedigree in software and has the resources to quickly shift that delivery model from on-premise to cloud with something like Microsoft Link. That's been a big driver for them. Or companies like F5 and Citrix that have the products that can help optimize the cloud network or secure the cloud network, as those are concepts that are really important for cloud delivery. So those are the kinds of vendors that have had a lot of success in terms of leveraging trends in cloud versus vendors that are really struggling against that move to cloud on their traditional, more hardware-oriented businesses. I do want to talk a little bit about SDN. I think it's arguably the biggest trend in networking today, and you could make the same case that it's the biggest disruptor in the history of networking. And I think what's been most interesting about SDN from my perspective is how it's changed the competitive landscape. Historically, if somebody wanted to get into the network market, they had to invest a lot of time and energy and money into building proprietary hardware. And that's, with SDN, and among other things, and cloud as well, that's not really the case anymore. And so SDN and cloud have really lowered the barrier to entry into the networking space, and that's why we're seeing software vendors, whether they're virtualization software vendors or vendors that have had a lot of success in the server virtualization market, companies like Microsoft and VMware that are now making their way into the network virtualization space, or whether there's some of these new startups that I'll call Whitebox software vendors, so companies like Big Switch and Cumulus and Pika 8. These are companies that are not only entering the space but getting a seat at the table in terms of getting opportunities for revenue that may have historically only been available to the traditional networking vendors like Cisco and HP. And so what that means for those traditional hardware-based vendors is they've had to do some things that you would never have expected them to do. And I think some more recent examples of that are what you're seeing from companies like Juniper and HP getting into what's being called the off-white or the bright box market. So in other words, taking industry standard or open industry standard commodity type hardware and putting more of a branded operating system or a partner operating system from somebody like Cumulus in the case of HP, and bringing that to market into some of these hyperscale data centers. This is something that historically we would not have seen before if not for cloud and SDN in terms of encroaching on the turf of these traditional vendors. So now that we've kind of set the stage as far as what's driving the transformation, we'll talk a little bit now about the how and the strategies that the enterprise network vendors are using to accelerate this transformation. And as I mentioned at the outset, the first one and one of the biggest ones is around headcount restructuring or realignment. And as I mentioned, it's about making sure that you've got enough people in the right places to capitalize on some of these opportunities in areas like cloud and SDN. And so what you see here on the chart is again, from our enterprise network vendor benchmark. This looks at the 16 vendors and looks at their total headcount, again, just in the enterprise networking space. So any headcount that's dedicated either to the telecom market or to other non-networking product lines, whether they're server storage, PC, what have you. Those aren't represented here. This is specifically around headcount that we estimate is dedicated to the enterprise networking market. And I've got a few examples highlighted here to show you the different ways and the different results that we're seeing. So you take a company like Cisco, where their overall headcount has actually declined or did decline from the third quarter of 2013 to the third quarter 2014, you can see from the chart that their enterprise network headcount actually grew slightly. And that's because they're making some investments in areas like cloud and security and SDN and pulling back from some of these other areas that are a little less strategic. The flip side of that is a company called Unify, or you may remember as Siemens Enterprise Communications. They're in the unified communication space. They've made a decision to really aggressively accelerate that, the business model transformation, making the decision last summer to essentially cut their headcount in half as they essentially abandon their legacy hardware business and reorient themselves around software services and cloud. And then you take a company like Huawei that most of their revenue, most of the business they do is in the telecom segment, but for them, the entire enterprise market is a growth market. And so that's why we're seeing them put a lot of headcount and resources into the enterprise market, because for them, from a company-wide basis, enterprise is really going to be a key growth engine for them versus their telecom market, their telecom business, which is starting to mature. So the second strategy that vendors are using for their business model transformation is around the development of line of business type solutions and line of business messaging and delivering business outcomes. If we think back over the years around on how networking was sold, traditionally it was sold to people in IT, whether they were CIOs or CTOs or they were IT managers and directors. That was essentially who the main decision makers were. Those were the type of people that the networking vendors really spent their time developing relationships with. And the sale was more about the products. What are the features? What's the quality, the reliability? Is it going to give me the performance that I need? Those product-specific types of things that is what people on the IT side and the network side specifically were looking at it in terms of value. That slowly and gradually evolved towards things like total cost of ownership. Okay, so your product is great, but what's this product going to cost me to buy and manage and maintain over a 5-year period? And then we started to see the influence of people in the CFO's office to kind of figure that out and them start to influence and be a part of the decision making. But where we're headed now is even broader than that. And people within organizations like marketing and operations and human resources are now starting to get involved in the decision because companies are recognizing that IT can become an enabler of a business outcome. So whether that business outcome is revenue growth or it's cost reduction or an increase in customer satisfaction, they're recognizing that IT can really help enable that business outcome. So you're getting people in these offices or these organizations, non-IT organizations, that are becoming influential in the decision-making process for IT equipment and solutions. So vendors are now starting to recognize that, and I think Cisco is a good example of one that's really trying to move into that direction and talking about networking as an architecture and how that architecture can help deliver that business income. And the vendors that are going to be the most successful over the long term are the ones that really recognize that and are able to shift their solutions and their messaging around business outcomes and appeal to those business buyers that are becoming more of a part of the IT decision-making process. And then last, we'll talk about strategic alliances. Obviously, alliances are nothing new. They've been part of the IT industry and the networking industry for some time. Obviously, the biggest benefits of alliances are they really do a few things. They allow vendors to fill portfolio gaps that they may have, whether they're in strategic segments or they're in non-strategic segments. It enables them to fill a portfolio gap without having to invest the greater amount of time and resources into developing and maintaining their own portfolio. More importantly, it allows them to minimize their risk. So they can partner with a company or a group of companies, say in the case of something like Intercloud, and leverage the position that those partners have in a particular market and take advantage of that while they can build their brand. So in other words, a company like Cisco is not necessarily well known in the cloud space. Obviously, they've been providing equipment that enables cloud for a long time, but they're not necessarily known as a cloud provider. So partnering with companies enables them to build their brand, get exposure to customers, those kinds of things without investing in building their brand otherwise or building their own products. And what I think is interesting now is the types of alliances that are being formed because of things like cloud and mobility and SDN. We're seeing relationships that you wouldn't have expected to see in the past. Relationships like Avaya and HP is one that I can think of in the cloud space. On the wireless side, you see companies like Juniper and Brocade and Dell. This is an example of companies where they view something like wireless as not really a strategic market, but they want to be able to provide solutions to their customers if they need them. Now, it's going to be interesting to see, given the announcement earlier this week about Aruba being bought by HP, how these three relationships change. But nonetheless, really the message there is that there are companies like Juniper and Brocade and Dell that look at wireless as a market that's, okay, it's important, we'd like to address it, but not strategic enough for us to really invest and maintain our own portfolio. It makes more sense for us to go ahead and partner with a leader like Aruba to address that market segment. And then obviously SDN has been a ton of partnering activity around SDN, and I've just got a few examples here. Particularly I'd like to highlight, I talked earlier about this kind of off-white or bright box switching market that's emerging. That's been, alliances has been a big component of the strategy of companies like Dell and HP to try to address that market without them having to go off and, kind of develop their own solutions. So last but not least, I want to talk about what's at stake here, as I mentioned at the outset. And again, I think it really comes down to survival. And over the long term, as we've seen, in terms of some of these segments, these hardware-focused segments and where the growth is or is not, vendors, it's really going to be important for them to make this business model transformation and this evolution to make sure that they can remain relevant and survive over the long term and really take advantage of some of these growth opportunities that we're seeing in some of these emerging segments. And what I think that means ultimately is that you'll see a lot of consolidation, whether it's the small SDN startups. As SDN starts to make its way further into the enterprise space, I think you'll see another wave of consolidation as these vendors kind of place their bets and look at where customers are spending in SDN and do they have the right portfolio. If not, let's go find a startup that's got not only a good technology that can address those needs, but have some customers that they can bring to the table. But more importantly, I think if you look at some of the vendors that are maybe niche players or don't have a lot of financial flexibility, those are the ones that I think are the biggest targets. And on the chart here, you see the shaded area, which I kind of call the acquisition zone. So these are companies that either are smaller in size, maybe they don't have a lot of financial flexibility to make the investments that they need to make to transform their business model and expand their addressable market. Those are the types of companies that I think are really the acquisition targets for the larger companies that are either able to take advantage of those opportunities or want to fill their portfolio gaps. So again, it really comes down to survival and the companies that over the long term that are able to survive and remain relevant and keep some of these other vendors that are starting to encroach on their core markets at bay are the ones that are able to make this shift and this evolution in their business model to survive over the long term. And so that gets us to the end of the presented material. I'd like to turn it over to Justin for questions.
All right. So yeah, if you have any questions, please send them through the Q&A function here, not the chat function. All right. So first question: the adaptation of vendors will have to. Well, also, hold on. We'll have to also on how fast the telecom companies will adopt SDN and NFV. Can you resend that question? I think there's a couple words missing there. Anyway, so next question, we'll get back to that one. Do you see Cisco making a play in the white box switching market?
Yeah, so I think that's an obvious question, particularly in the context of what you see in what we've seen lately from companies like Juniper and HP. I think the answer, at least for the short term, is no. If you've heard any of some of John Chambers' public statements, they're really coming after not only just the white box switching market, but just commodity in general with this architectural play. So in other words, they feel that an architecture based on Cisco products provides greater value than a network that's full of individual point products from commodity vendors because of things like a better integration and tighter management and increased security and lower total cost of ownership. So I think they'll continue with that strategy. What remains to be seen is how quickly or how well some of these white box solutions make their way into the enterprise space. I don't think there's any question that there's value in those solutions for the telecom providers and the cloud providers that are operating these huge, kind of hyperscale data centers, but it remains to be seen what the appetite for these kinds of solutions is going to be into the broader enterprise market. So I think that will be really the driver and the indicator of whether or not Cisco changes its tune there.
All right, cool. So it says you were claiming that networking vendors are starting to sell to CMOs, CFOs, and COOs. How do you prove that kind of claim? A CFO would always be involved because of the cost. COO usually. IT reports through them, but what about the CMO?
Yeah, so I guess the way that I would answer that question is based on the research that we've done in the talking to vendors and the briefings that we get and the interactions that we have from them, that's what vendors are telling us. We also know from some of the customer research that we've done in areas that are adjacent to networking, like converged infrastructure and surveying line of business managers, we know that's what's happening. I think compared to some of the other IT markets and IT vendors like IBM and HP and even some of the systems integrators, the networking vendors are not doing that nearly as much. A lot of that has to do with the fact that obviously there's a lot more vendors out there and a lot more pure plays that are still focused on selling the value of their technology. So I think that something that we'll start to see. And you also have to consider a company like HP that sells a heck of a lot more than networking. So they're coming at the CMO and the CFO and the COO with a much broader solution set that covers things other than networking. But I think this is something you're going to start to see more and more. The degree to which that happens obviously depends on the vendor and the number of solutions that they're able to bring.
All right. The adaptation of vendors will rely on how fast the telecom companies will adopt SDN and NFV. How do you see this transformation at customer level?
So I definitely agree with that first statement. I think what I've seen over the years is a lot of the trends that happen in the telecom market first eventually find their way into the enterprise market. We've seen that in areas like managed services. Managed services have been around in the telecom space for a long time, and now we're starting to see enterprise customers start to look at that as a viable alternative. And we're seeing that in other areas of our coverage like converged infrastructure. And I think the commodity switching, the white box, SDN, all those kinds of things is going to follow suit. The question now comes down, it's a little bit of a different sale, and the application is a little bit different. So I think what's going to be critical for vendors is how do they shape the messaging and how do they adjust their solutions to make it a good fit. I think as we start to make that gradual transformation, and it's already happening. We've seen from companies like VMware that they've got solutions like NSX being deployed in industries other than telecom. But what I think it comes down to is how are they able to adjust those solutions to make them applicable to the enterprise market and make them, consumable and all those things. And I think you'll start to see that first in the industries where the networking requirements maybe are similar to a telecom or a cloud provider, whether that's something like transportation or whether that's financial services or what have you. So that's kind of the progression that I would see there.
Do you think SDN Whitebox solutions will be easier to adopt in the branch office or the larger data centers?
I think you'd see it first in the data centers. Kind of piggybacking on what I just said a minute ago, I think that the companies that are operating these huge data centers and have some similar needs maybe in terms of scale and flexibility and agility will start to look at those first. I think really one of the biggest barriers, I think, for some of these white box solutions in the enterprise market is, really what's the true cost? And I think some of these kind of off-white or bright box solutions might be an indicator of where this market actually goes, because you really got a few different issues that an enterprise customer has to think about. And that the first one is, what is this solution really going to cost me? Not only in terms of dollars, but in terms of my, people's time and energy to buy the components, integrate them, support them, all those things. And, if I want to buy a solution from a company like Big Switch and Cumulus, how can I be sure that they're going to be around 5 years from now? So those are really the two biggest issues, I think, that would prevent adoption of those solutions in the broader enterprise market, and why I think the moves that Juniper and HP are making are good ones, because it kind of addresses some of those concerns by giving them something that's pre-integrated, backed by a vendor that's got pedigree in the networking market and supported by a vendor that's got the capabilities to support it, and financially, will be around 5 years from now.
Do you have a point of view on how these changes will change the ecosystem of partners who drive the sales for vendors?
So I'm assuming you mean channel partners, in which case, yeah, I think the move to solution selling and the move to, selling to line of business is really an important one. And I think, though, just like there'll be vendors left behind, I think there'll be partners left behind, too. And I think you're seeing, and I think you will see, vendors start to put more time and energy into training their partners on how to make this shift, too, in terms of how to sell these solutions and how to take the vendor solutions and package them together in an appropriate way. So, yeah, the channel partners are a huge part of it. I don't see them going away. I don't see Cisco, doing more direct business because of these things. I think it just comes more on helping them educate their channel and putting them in the best position to be successful in terms of making this shift along with them.
All right, next question. What is your opinion of SDN from the CIO perspective? Are they brought in if they're a tipping point? VMware NSX has a great solution for this, but resistance is the network folks in the enterprise.
I absolutely agree. So I guess to answer the second question first, I think that's been a big barrier. I think if you think back over the years, it's really been the network teams that have made all the decisions around the network. And now I think because of the success of server virtualization and who the VMwares in the world are selling to, the server teams are getting a little bit more of a voice and getting a seat at the table, so to speak. And I think there certainly is some internal hurdles and obstacles and political battles that are taking place around the decision that's being made. Now, VMware is trying to overcome some of that by saying, hey, look, you can put in both VMware, NSX, and Cisco ACI if you want. They can coexist. But I certainly think that that's an issue, and I think a lot of the issue is around security and how security gets addressed with SDN and some of these other solutions like from VMware. I think that's a huge part of it, but I couldn't agree more as far as the server and network teams and how that decision is either inhibiting or expediting the process. On the CIO question, you know, I think in general, the technical advantages of an SDN architecture are there, and I think they make sense. But I still think the business case is lacking, and I think that's really the tipping point that we need to get past for adoption to really start to accelerate. So the technical case is there, but again, I think it's more of a business case because, and I think SDN and network virtualization hasn't taken off quite as quickly as server virtualization did because of the complexity that's involved. I think it was much easier for customers to understand the benefits of server virtualization, and it was much easier for a business case to be made. I think there are more moving parts with the network, and because you've got different teams now that are involved in the decision, that process is just taking much longer. So again, I think that the technical case is there, and the advantages from a network standpoint and having an architecture based on SDN, it makes sense. Obviously, the vendor solutions, I think, have to be a little bit more mature and proven. So I think that's another one, but predominantly it's that business case, and you know, CIO's got to be comfortable that that business case can be made.
Great. The next question: any insight on NSX adoption? Pricing is thousands of dollars per host, which makes the price tag extremely high for larger organizations. How do they justify the cost?
Yeah, so that's, you know, really a key battleground, and I think one of the issues, and I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, around SDN adoption is really what's the true cost. So what's the true cost of, if I'm a Cisco customer, what's the true cost of implementing NSX versus, you know, a 9000 with ACI? Because I think you're right, there's a software cost, there's an integration cost, there's a cost around getting people trained on how to use the products and making sure that you know, it's going to be supported, you know, versus if you're a Cisco customer and you want to stick with ACI, does it make more sense for you because you've got this install base already? You know how your people know how to manage Cisco equipment. Yeah, you may or may not pay a little bit more in terms of CapEx up front, because of you might need some new hardware, but over the course of 5 years, do you end up saving money because you don't have some of maybe the integration and the support and the training costs that you might have to implement something like NSX? I think it's an important question. I don't necessarily have an answer one way or the other, but I think it's an important question that customers have to ask themselves.
All right. What is your analysis regarding New Edge Network SDN solution and their partnership with HP?
So I'm a little familiar with New Edge. I haven't had a deep dive or an understanding of how they're approaching SDN. I think you know, the partnership with HP is obviously an important one. It's a partnership that Alcatel-Lucent and HP has had with HP for a long time. Where it fits into the mix, I'm not quite sure. In fact, this might be a good question for to follow up on and have more of a direct conversation with you and get some more specifics on kind of what you're after.
All right. Where do you see some of the big systems integrators positioned in this market?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We, along with the enterprise network market forecast that we did, we did some market share analysis, and what we found was a couple of the top market share vendors in this market are systems integrators because of the amount of revenue they do in network-related services. So these are companies like IBM and Accenture. Now, obviously, they're coming at the market differently because they are delivering solutions around that are broader pieces to it. So in other words, a cloud solution for Accenture is going to involve more than just network equipment. There's going to be software and servers and storage and maybe even something around devices. So the network benefits from that because they're still providing services around the network equipment as well, because that's a part of that broader solution. But because of the partnerships that these companies have with Cisco and with others, and because of the demand for customers around these solutions, cloud and mobility and others, they're getting a tremendous amount of revenue from services related to the network infrastructure, enough to put them in amongst the top market share leaders.
All right. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions here.
Okay.
How will HP's acquisition of Aruba impact Cisco and others in the wireless LAN market?
Yeah, it was a very interesting move that happened earlier this week, and I mentioned it when I was talking about alliances because there are relationships that vendors like Brocade and Juniper that compete with HP in the networking space have with Aruba. So it'll be interesting to see how those, I think that's going to be the most interesting thing about that acquisition is how some of these OEM relationships and partnerships get sorted out. Obviously, the acquisition immediately puts HP in the #2 position in terms of wireless LAN market share behind Cisco. In fact, by our estimates, they essentially tripled their wireless LAN revenue by picking up Aruba. So they get a strong portfolio, a large customer base that they can now start to cross-sell other HP solutions into. Strong presence in some key verticals like education, like government. They've got, Aruba was one of the first vendors with a cloud-managed Wi-Fi offering, so that's something that HP's, I think, was looking at in terms of having a solution that's a little bit more mature and has a little bit of more of a head start. So a lot of good stuff for HP there. I think you could argue that they may be overpaid a little bit with a $2.7 billion price tag. But I think for them, not only just for wireless LAN, but how that fits into broader solutions for HP around things like, you know, Internet of Things and all those types of things. I think it was a smart move for HP, and I think looking at wireless probably the best one they could have made.
All right. Final question. What's your take on John Chambers' public statement about VMware being a competitor?
Yes. So for those of you that didn't hear this during Cisco's last earnings call, John Chambers essentially stated publicly what people had suspected for some time, which was that VMware was becoming more of a competitor. And he said explicitly that they viewed VMware as a competitor. Now, I think if you look at the relationship that Cisco has had with VMware historically in the data center, particularly in areas like converged infrastructure with VCE, that will certainly continue. The battleground, obviously, for these two companies is going to be with SDN and network virtualization. And I think what the statement does is it kind of gives permission in a way for VMware to start to more aggressively target Cisco customers that may be looking at SDN. And I think it gives Cisco a little bit more permission to be more aggressive with VMware. But it's clear that it looks like Cisco is kind of taken the first shot, so to speak, at least publicly. So it'd be really interesting to see how this develops. But I think Cisco's done a good job over the years in terms of managing a lot of relationships that were, you know, both competitive and cooperative, so to speak. And so I think they'll continue to do that, particularly when you look at areas like converged infrastructure in the data center that still have a lot of room to grow. I think they'll partner where it makes sense, and I think they'll compete where it's in either one of the company's best interests.
All right. Well, thank you, Scott, and thank you, everyone, for your questions. You can follow both Scott and TBR and the Twitter handles listed here, and please check out our pages on SlideShare and YouTube as well. Additionally, before you sign off, we'd like to ask you to take a brief survey about today's webinar. As we research performance of technology companies, we're also studying how we're helping our clients, and your feedback will be greatly appreciated. We'll leave the chat function open for another few minutes or so to give folks one last chance to ask any last-minute questions. Otherwise, we'll see you again next quarter. Thanks.